March 1918. The world was at war, and the Atlantic was a dangerous place. Merchant ships steamed under the shadow of German U-boats, and every captain knew the ocean could turn violent without warning. But that night, the sea was deceptively calm, rolling dark waves under a pale moon, stretching endlessly in every direction. There was no wind to carry the creak of ropes, no gulls to break the silence. It was the kind of stillness that felt wrong, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, between the coast of Barbados and the open waters leading north, a U.S. Navy ship known as the USS Cyclops was making her way home. She was massive, over 500 feet long, built to carry coal for America's war fleet, and on board were 306 souls. Sailors, officers, engineers, even a few civilian passengers. They were tired, eager to see their families, and unaware that they were sailing into the heart of one of the strangest disappearances in naval history. No one on land knew it at the time, but this would be the last voyage of the Cyclops. The ship had left Brazil loaded not with coal, but with manganese ore, heavy, dense, and essential for steelmaking in wartime. Her final stop had been in Bridgetown, Barbados, where she took on supplies before turning north toward Baltimore. Witnesses on the island would later recall the sight of her in the harbor, sitting low in the water, perhaps too low. Some claim they could see the strain in her hull, though the Navy would never confirm such details. Yet, despite the whispers, the weather was calm, the sky was clear, and no one expected trouble. The Cyclops slipped out of Barbados under the cover of night, her black hull blending into the darkness, and steamed toward the vast emptiness ahead. What happened next has been debated for more than a century, because after that night, there were no more sightings, no radio distress calls, no SOS messages, nothing. The Cyclops was equipped with wireless telegraphy, and multiple stations along her route should have been able to pick up even a weak signal. But the airwaves remained silent. For days, the families of the crew waited, scanning newspapers for word of delays or mechanical trouble. Instead, silence stretched into weeks. Rumors began to swirl, whispers of storms, sabotage, even enemy action, but without evidence, they were only shadows. The ocean has a way of swallowing secrets whole, but the disappearance of the Cyclops was more than a ship lost at sea. It was the scale of it, the sheer number of men, the cargo, the size of the vessel that made the silence so unsettling. Ships sink in storms. Sailors are lost to war. But they leave behind traces, wreckage, oil slicks, bodies. The Cyclops left nothing. Not a plank, not a lifeboat, not a scrap of the uniforms worn by the men who had laughed and smoked on her decks just days earlier. One day she was there, and the next she was gone, as if she had been erased from existence. In the spring of 1918, wartime America was already accustomed to loss, but the Navy's announcement was still a shock. The official telegrams to families were blunt: missing, presumed lost at sea. There was no explanation, no comfort, no closure. Mothers clutched photographs of sons who would never walk through the door again. Wives lit lamps in the window long after the Navy had stopped searching. Some refused to believe it entirely, convinced that their loved ones had been captured, hidden away in some German prison camp, waiting for the war's end to come home. For years after, letters would arrive at Navy offices, asking if the Cyclops had been spotted anywhere in the world. Every reply was the same: there was no news. The silence of that night still lingers in every telling of the story. Calm seas, a ship heavy with ore, hundreds of men asleep in their bunks, unaware that the ocean beneath them was about to take them without warning, without struggle, without even a chance to say goodbye. And somewhere, deep beneath the Atlantic, if the Cyclops lies at all, she lies in darkness, her steel hull entombing the voices of 306 souls, voices the world never heard again. She was built for strength, not speed, a steel giant of the U.S. Navy, 542 feet from bow to stern, towering masts braced against the wind, and cavernous holds designed to carry the lifeblood of the fleet: coal. The USS Cyclops was a collier, a ship whose mission was simple but essential: keep America's warships fueled and ready for battle. During wartime, she was more than a cargo vessel. She was the unseen backbone of naval power, a workhorse of steel and steam. Her triple expansion steam engines churned steadily beneath the decks, and when fully loaded, she could carry more than 10,000 tons. She was the Navy's dependable giant, a ship that seemed invincible to those who served aboard her. By early 1918, the war had stretched on for nearly 4 years overseas, and America's involvement was in full force. The Cyclops had been dispatched to Brazil, not for coal this time, but for manganese ore, an essential ingredient for hardening steel, a material desperately needed for the weapons and armor feeding the war effort. Her holds were packed deep with the heavy black ore, so dense it weighed far more than coal. The load made her ride lower in the water, her bulk pressing deep into the Atlantic swells. It was a mission of logistics, not glory, but every man aboard knew the cargo they carried was as vital to the war as any battleship. The crew was a mix of seasoned sailors, young recruits, and civilian passengers. Among them were officers who had spent their careers at sea, engineers who could coax life out of the stubborn steam engines, and deckhands who had learned the rhythm of rope, salt, and steel. There were men from small Midwestern towns who had never seen the ocean until the Navy took them there, and men from coastal cities who had been born to the sea. Each carried private dreams of the life they would return to when the war was over, letters from sweethearts tucked into sea chests, photographs of children wrapped in oilskin to protect them from salt water. The Cyclops' commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, was a man known for his strict discipline and sharp temper. He was respected for his experience, though not universally liked. To some, his manner was abrasive, but he was a captain who understood the dangers of the Atlantic in wartime. He kept his ship in order with a firm hand, and the Cyclops had delivered her missions without serious incident under his command. By the end of February 1918, the ship's business in Brazil was concluded. Her cargo holds groaned with the weight of manganese ore, her deck awash in the smell of salt and metal. Salvador, the bustling port city where she had loaded her final shipments, was alive with the noise of markets, street vendors, and the ever-present chatter of dock workers. For days, the Cyclops had been anchored there, taking on supplies, repairing minor equipment, and preparing for the long voyage north. Sailors on shore leave wandered the cobblestone streets, drinking coffee strong enough to make their hands shake, buying trinkets for their families, and taking in what might be their last moments of peace before another stretch at sea. On the 4th of March, the Cyclops raised anchor and began her slow departure from Salvador's harbor. Her course was set for Baltimore, Maryland, but she would first make a scheduled stop in Bridgetown, Barbados, to refuel and resupply. The skies were bright, the seas calm, and the departure was without incident. Dock workers watched her slide away from the port, the sun flashing off her steel hull, her American flag snapping in the warm wind. It was a sight they had seen many times before, another ship leaving for the open sea. But for the men aboard, there was an unspoken awareness of the danger ahead. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hunting merchant and supply ships, and the Cyclops, unarmed save for a few deck guns, would be an inviting target. Still, there was confidence in her size and reputation. She was not fast, but she was solid, a floating fortress of iron. The crew settled into the routines they knew well: watch rotations, engine room maintenance, deck cleaning, and the endless work of keeping a ship at sea running smoothly. The first leg of the journey was uneventful, the great ship moving steadily northward along the coast of South America. Each sunrise brought the same rituals: coffee brewed in the galley, the smell of hot oil and steam in the engine room, and the constant, low hum of the ship's machinery. At night, the sea was a vast sheet of black glass under the stars, and the Cyclops plowed through it like a shadow, her bow splitting the swells in silence. Few aboard could have imagined that these familiar rhythms were ticking down the final days of both the ship and the lives within her steel walls. They were a crew in transit, homeward bound, with no warning that the ocean had already chosen their fate. March 9th, 1918. The morning sun poured over the quiet harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados, casting golden light across the water. Fishermen tending their nets watched the steel hulk of the USS Cyclops at anchor, her black hull towering above the smaller vessels that bobbed nearby. To those who saw her that day, she was an impressive sight, massive, purposeful, the kind of ship that looked as if it could weather any storm. But some noticed details that, in hindsight, took on a far more ominous meaning. A Navy officer from another vessel reportedly remarked that she sat low in the water, deeper than seemed safe for open-sea travel. It was subtle, the kind of thing only a trained eye would see, but it suggested her heavy cargo of manganese ore was pushing her dangerously close to her limits. There was no sign of distress, no visible damage, and no hint that this would be her last port of call. The crew moved with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Supplies were loaded, fresh water taken on, and fuel stores topped up. In town, some sailors took the opportunity for one final day ashore. They walked the narrow streets, drank in the salty air, and made small purchases in the market. A few sent letters, posting them with the unspoken hope they would arrive in America before the ship herself did. There was laughter, there was talk of home, and there was a shared assumption that by the end of the month, they would be safely docked in Baltimore. That evening, as the last light faded and the tropical heat softened into night, the Cyclops prepared to depart. She slipped away from the harbor under a moonlit sky, her engines beating a steady rhythm that echoed across the still water. The sea was calm, unusually so, and the weather forecast showed nothing to fear. It was the kind of voyage captains welcomed, smooth sailing ahead, clear skies above. As she headed north into the Atlantic, her navigation lights glowed faintly in the darkness until, one by one, they vanished from the sight of anyone who might have been watching from shore. From that moment forward, the USS Cyclops existed only in the minds of her crew and in the ink of her logbook records that, if they ever survived, were never seen again. She was equipped with wireless telegraphy, capable of reaching stations along her planned route, the ocean between Barbados and the USS. East Coast was far from empty. There were merchant ships, patrol vessels, and island stations, all within reasonable contact range. Even in the event of mechanical failure or an unexpected storm, she should have been able to send a message, but no call for help ever came. Not a single SOS. The airwaves were silent. Days passed. In Baltimore, where her arrival was expected, dock hands prepared for the unloading of her valuable cargo. In homes across the country, families looked forward to letters and telegrams from their husbands, brothers, and sons. When the ship failed to appear on her scheduled date, there was no immediate panic. Delays were common at sea, especially during wartime, and many assumed she had simply taken a slower course or detoured to avoid enemy submarines. But as more days slipped by, unease began to set in. The Navy reached out to coastal wireless stations, inquiring if anyone had heard from the Cyclops. The answer was always the same: nothing. Merchant vessels along her likely path reported no sightings. There was no floating wreckage, no lifeboats adrift, no oil slick marking a disaster. It was as if the ship had been plucked from the surface of the ocean without leaving a trace. Sailors from other ships whispered about the Bermuda Triangle, though the term would not gain public recognition for decades. Others speculated about a catastrophic structural failure, imagining her heavy cargo shifting suddenly in rough seas, capsizing her before the crew could react. But the seas had been calm, and no storms were recorded in the region during those days. By the end of March, hope had begun to fade. The Navy, under the pressure of war, released only sparse information to the public. Officially, the Cyclops was overdue, but still presumed operational. Privately, officers began to accept that she was gone. The absence of even the smallest fragment of debris was baffling. Ships sink, yes, but they leave something behind. The silence was more than unsettling. It was unnatural. In the homes of the missing, families clung to the belief that no news could mean their loved ones were alive somewhere, perhaps captured, perhaps stranded on an uncharted island. Mothers lit candles in their windows. Wives refused to pack away uniforms. Children asked when their fathers would come home, and no one could bring themselves to say the truth aloud. Somewhere between Bridgetown and the mainland, 306 souls had vanished into the vast Atlantic, and no living person could say how or why. The Cyclops had slipped beyond the reach of radio, beyond the reach of rescue, and into a place from which no word would ever return. From the moment the USS Cyclops failed to arrive in Baltimore, the questions began. They started quietly at first, between officers behind closed doors, in hushed conversations among sailors in other ports, but soon spread to every dockside tavern, every naval yard, every coastal newsroom. How could a ship that size simply vanish? The Cyclops was not a small craft swallowed by a rogue wave. She was a steel giant, over 500 feet long, with wireless telegraph equipment and a crew trained for emergencies. Yet she had not sent a single distress call. It was as though she had been erased from existence in an instant, and the lack of explanation was a breeding ground for suspicion. The most straightforward theory was that she had suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The Cyclops was carrying a dangerously heavy load of manganese ore, denser and less stable than coal. If the cargo shifted suddenly in heavy seas, it could have caused the ship to list, capsize, or break apart. Some suggested that the ship's keel, or structural supports, may have already been weakened from years of service, making her vulnerable to disaster. But this idea raised another troubling question. The weather between Barbados and Baltimore had been calm. No storms, no rogue waves, nothing that could explain a sudden, silent collapse. And even if she had broken apart, there should have been debris, lifeboats, life rings, crates, yet the ocean gave up nothing. Others, steeped in the fears of wartime, looked to Germany. In March 1918, the Atlantic was alive with U-boat patrols. German submarines were known to attack merchant and military ships alike, often without warning. Could the Cyclops have been torpedoed, her crew lost, before they could send an SOS? It was possible, but German naval records released after the war listed no such sinking. And even in a successful attack, debris would typically float to the surface: wood, oil, and human remains. The total absence of evidence made this explanation seem incomplete, though it remained one of the most persistent theories. Then came the darker whispers, the ones the Navy avoided addressing in public: mutiny and sabotage. Some who had served with the Cyclops' captain, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, described him as an abrasive man who ruled his ship with an iron hand. Rumors unsubstantiated, but insistence spread that the crew had grown restless under his command. In one version of events, a fight broke out, escalating into mutiny. In another, German sympathizers within the crew seized control of the ship, delivering her to an enemy port. The most sensational claims even suggested that Worley himself had German ties, though no credible evidence ever emerged. Still, in the tense climate of 1918, when paranoia about spies and saboteurs ran high, such theories found an eager audience. Beyond these earthly explanations, there was the idea that would come to define the Cyclops' legend for generations. She had been swallowed by the same forces that would later be blamed for countless other disappearances, the area of the Atlantic, now known as the Bermuda Triangle. This theory was not yet a household term, but seafarers already spoke of certain waters between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico where ships and planes vanished without a trace. Could the Cyclops have crossed into some deadly, uncharted current, a place where magnetic compasses spun wildly and reality itself seemed to fracture? It sounded like fiction, but for those staring at the blank line where the Cyclops' course should have been, it offered as good an answer as any. War censorship deepened the mystery. The Navy, bound by the need to protect morale and avoid giving away vulnerabilities, released only the barest details. Newspapers reported the disappearance, but offered no speculation. The official stance was one of vague regret and uncertainty. This vacuum of information allowed rumors to flourish. Letters circulated claiming that a telegram had been received in South America, stating the Cyclops had been captured and taken to an enemy port. Another story told of a coded message intercepted by British intelligence that hinted at the ship's survival in foreign waters. None of these claims were ever verified, but they kept hope alive for families unwilling to accept that their loved ones were gone. Months passed, then years, and no new evidence surfaced. The official record eventually concluded that the USS Cyclops was lost at sea, cause unknown. But in the minds of sailors, dock workers, and grieving relatives, the question remained open. Was it an act of war, a fatal engineering flaw, a human betrayal, or something beyond human comprehension? The truth lay somewhere in the deep, silent darkness of the Atlantic, a place no diver or search vessel had yet dared to find. For every theory offered, another hole in the logic appeared, and so the Cyclops' fate became a canvas for speculation, a mystery both anchored in history and adrift in legend. Even today, more than a century later, the questions outnumber the answers, and the sea has yet to speak. It began with silence, and it ended with silence. The first families knew of the USS Cyclops' disappearance not from an official announcement, but from the uneasy realization that the ship's expected arrival date had come and gone without word. At first, there was patience. Delays at sea were nothing unusual in wartime, but as days turned to weeks, dread began to seep in. Mothers, wives, and children made anxious visits to Navy offices, hoping for a letter, a telegram, anything. The answers they received were thin, polite, and empty. The Cyclops was overdue. There was no cause for alarm, and updates would be given as soon as they became available. Those updates never came. When the Navy finally admitted the truth, it did so with a cold efficiency. Telegrams arrived in homes across America, each one short enough to fit in a single breath. Missing. Presumed lost at sea. There was no explanation, no account of a storm or an attack, no details about the final moments of the ship. Just those few words, typed in black ink, sealing the fate of 306 souls. To the families, it was a death sentence without a body, a grave without a location. Some held the telegrams in their hands for hours, staring at the letters as though sheer willpower could make the words change. In wartime America, tragedy was never in short supply. Soldiers were killed in France, merchant ships were sunk by German U-boats, and headlines screamed daily of loss and sacrifice. Yet the story of the Cyclops never dominated the papers. It was there, printed in small columns, sandwiched between casualty reports and war bond advertisements, but it never became a national obsession. Part of this was deliberate. The Navy, facing the reality that one of its largest ships had vanished without a trace, offered no speculation and discouraged the press from doing so. Morale was everything, and the sudden, unexplained loss of a vital supply ship could not be allowed to overshadow the war effort. The media, compliant in the name of patriotism, reported the bare facts. They mentioned the last port of call, the number of men aboard, and the official statement from the Navy. They did not dig for answers. There were no investigative features, no interviews with grieving families, no front-page outrage demanding an inquiry. To most Americans reading the news, the Cyclops was just another casualty of a brutal, unpredictable war. The details, what little there were, faded quickly from public attention. Behind the scenes, however, there were whispers. Some naval officers admitted privately that they had never seen a case quite like it. Ships went missing, yes, but ships left behind debris. Even the worst wrecks scattered something on the waves. That the Cyclops had simply ceased to exist was deeply unsettling. A few suspected that the ship's dangerous cargo might be to blame. Years later, historians would uncover cargo logs suggesting that the Cyclops had been overloaded with manganese ore far beyond safe limits. The dense heavy mineral was far more dangerous than coal. If it shifted suddenly during the voyage, it could have unbalanced the ship so quickly that there was no time for distress calls or lifeboats. A sharp list, a violent roll, and a ship could capsize in minutes, dragging everyone aboard into the depths. It was a plausible theory, but it still failed to explain the total lack of wreckage. Even a sudden capsize in calm seas would leave something behind: wooden lifeboats, barrels, planks, cargo crates, but in the Cyclops' case, the Atlantic remained as smooth and empty as before. And then there was the matter of the captain, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley. His reputation for a harsh command style and rumors of personal disputes with crew members added fuel to darker suspicions. The Navy never pursued those lines publicly, but they lingered in the minds of those who found the cargo theory too simple for such a colossal disappearance. For the families, the official explanations, when they came at all, were meaningless. What they wanted was the truth, or at the very least, the comfort of knowing where their loved ones lay. Instead, they were left with fragments, secondhand rumors, unverified sightings, and stories passed along dockside like folktales. Some insisted the Cyclops had been taken by a German raider, and that the crew was being held in a prison camp, waiting for the war's end to return. Others claimed she had been seen limping into an unnamed South American port under a different flag. None of these stories were ever confirmed, but in the absence of hard facts, they were clung to as lifelines by those unable to accept that the ship was gone forever. In the years after the war, the Cyclops' name faded from headlines, but she never disappeared entirely from memory. Sailors spoke of her in low voices, adding her to the growing list of ships lost in that strange stretch of ocean where compasses failed and weather turned without warning. For the Navy, the case remained open in the most technical sense, her fate unknown. For historians, she became a puzzle, a wartime enigma made all the more haunting by the simplicity of her last known details. Calm seas, clear skies, no distress signal. Even now, more than a century later, the Cyclops' loss stands as one of the largest unexplained disappearances in U.S. naval history. The ocean has a way of erasing its mistakes, burying them under miles of shifting water, but the questions linger. Was she doomed by the weight she carried? Was she the victim of an enemy unseen? Or was her fate written in forces that have nothing to do with war, storms, or steel? Until the day her hull is found in the black silence of the Atlantic, the USS Cyclops will remain both a ship and a shadow, her true story known only to the deep. The sea has always been a keeper of secrets, but some, it clutches so tightly that even time cannot pry them free. Imagine it, a ship nearly 550 feet long, brimming with steel and coal, crewed by over 300 sailors, steaming north through the restless Atlantic. In the spring of 1918, as World War I dragged on, the USS Cyclops was expected to glide into Baltimore Harbor, carrying her load of manganese ore for the war effort. Families awaited telegrams. The Navy awaited her precious cargo, but Cyclops never arrived. No distress call, no sighting, no drifting wreckage, just absence. And in that sudden silence, 306 lives were swallowed whole. For weeks, ships combed the suspected route, hoping for lifeboats, flotsam, even a single crate bobbing on the waves, anything to prove Cyclops had existed beyond that last calm day she was seen in Barbados. But the ocean offered nothing. Some blamed a sudden storm, the kind that can rise like a fist from a clear horizon. Others whispered about German U-boats, stealthy predators lurking beneath the waves. And then there were the quiet few who said this was no ordinary disappearance, that Cyclops had ventured into a stretch of ocean where compasses spin, radios crackle into silence, and ships vanish. In the years that followed, the Navy's official stance was frustratingly vague. The ship was lost without trace, and yet hints emerged. Decades later, cargo records suggested something odd. Cyclops had been carrying far more manganese ore than her hull was designed to bear. Overloaded, she might have rolled suddenly in rough seas, taking every man aboard into the deep in less than a minute. But if that were true, why was there no debris, no oil slick? Why didn't a single crew member, trained in survival at sea, manage to launch a lifeboat? Survivors of similar sinkings had often been found clinging to wreckage days later. With Cyclops, the Atlantic remained mute. The mystery only deepened when you realized Cyclops was part of a small fleet of sister ships. Over the next 3 decades, 2 more would vanish under eerily similar circumstances. No distress calls, no wreckage, just gone. It was as if the ships themselves had been plucked out of reality, erased without warning. Some sailors refused to serve aboard them, convinced that certain vessels carried a curse. And then there are the stranger accounts, stories from other mariners who sailed the same waters in the months after Cyclops disappeared. A Brazilian freighter claimed to have seen an enormous silhouette sliding silently beneath the waves at twilight, moving against the current. A British merchant vessel reported strange, greenish lights flickering beneath its hull for nearly an hour one night, followed by a sudden drop in temperature so sharp that crew members swore they could see their breath, even in tropical waters. None of these reports could be tied directly to Cyclops, but sailors talk, and legends grow in the telling. For the families, the years brought only more questions. Letters from loved ones stopped abruptly. Pay stopped. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. Widows and mothers were left to mourn in the shadow of a ship that had been erased from the world. Even the captain's own decisions that voyage were called into question. Why had he chosen that exact route? And why did he avoid known shipping lanes in wartime, when safety in numbers was the norm? Some suspected espionage, a secret mission never entered into the logs. If so, whatever Cyclops carried that day might have been more valuable and more dangerous than manganese ore. As the decades rolled on, the Atlantic shifted and changed, swallowing new ships and revealing old wrecks. Yet Cyclops remained hidden. Modern sonar surveys of the region have uncovered thousands of anomalies, metallic shapes buried under silt, but none have been definitively linked to her. It's as though the ocean itself is unwilling to give her back. And maybe it never will. The deep sea is vast, cold, and indifferent. It can keep a secret for centuries. And so, the Cyclops lingers in the mind like a ghost. A steel leviathan frozen in time, somewhere far below the surface, her decks silent and her hold still heavy with the ore that may have doomed her. The faces of 306 sailors, men who laughed, fought, wrote letters home, are locked away in that darkness. Whether she lies tilted on her side on the ocean floor or was claimed by something stranger, no one can say. But those who sail those waters still glance at their compasses a little more often, still watch the horizon for signs of weather that isn't in the charts. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily, and somewhere, deep below, the USS Cyclops still lies, holding the stories of 306 souls. You can almost imagine her outline, a shadow drifting through the murk, vanishing into blackness as the current takes her deeper still, and, in that cold, crushing silence, the mystery endures, unchallenged, unsolved, and unforgettable.